G'day, Cooldown 2000 here. I'm back with another Borderlands 3 video for you guys, as today I'm going to be going over my Fist of the Wind Amara 3.0 build. Fist of the Wind Amara is a melee build that focuses on using the Spiritual Driver class mod. And while the Spiritual Driver does not give you any bonus melee damage, or as unlike something like the Breaker Com or the newly added Muse Com from DLC 4, it makes up for this in giving you two really handy utilities things that a melee build can have. It gives you bonus movement speed and the ability to keep your roid shields down all the time by simply using your action skill. And these are two things that a melee build really need, as bonus movement speed allows you to get to your enemies much more quicker, so you're not pretty much out in the open for long periods of time without being able to hurt your enemies, as for a melee build your best effective range is however far you can throw your fist. And if you can't get to your targets quick enough, you're going to die. So bonus movement speed is really important. And being able to keep your roid shields down all the time is really handy, as roid shields give you bonus melee damage while your shields are depleted. Being able to keep your shields depleted pretty much all the time by simply applying a dot to yourself with the Spiritual Driver is insanely handy. And the great thing about this build is that it can kind of do it all, and it doesn't require any DLC. All the gear I'll be showing off can either be found in the base game, or you can find equivalent if I show off gear that, or you can find pretty much identical equivalents that don't require any DLC. And yeah, as I mentioned, this build can do it all. Mobbing, you're going to have no issues as you'll be using ties that bind. For bossing, if ties that bind isn't going to work for you, you've got access to the Stinger Shield, and that can melt bosses pretty easily. And you've got a face puncher for taking out flying enemies basically, and getting second wins. So there's not really this build kind of just utilizes everything at your disposal to go through the entire game, but with as true of a melee build as possible, while using certain other gear to help, get past certain areas that would be a little tough for true melee, like single target bosses. That's where the Stinger comes in, as I've mentioned. I'll leave timestamps in the description so you can bounce between each part of this build. So there'll be a gear section, a skill section, a guardian rank section, and a mayhem modifier section. So if you just want to bounce between each of those things and you only want to see one part, or you want to see another part, or you want to see just a general description in each, you get where I'm going. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's just jump into this. So starting with the gear, let's just jump into the most important weapon you'll need to carry with you, which is a bladed weapon with the gain 300% increased weapon damage against enemies above 90% health anointment. This anointment is really important for a melee build, as while the anointment says it boosts weapon damage, this is a lie as it boosts all damage. This includes melee damage, action skill damage, etc, etc. And this is important because this will allow you to have your first melee strike do a really large amount of damage. And this is important because we'll be utilizing the Unleash the Dragon artifact. The Unleash the Dragon gives your melee attacks a guaranteed chance to ignite enemies on fire, and the dot damage the Unleash the Dragon does scales off of how hard your melee hit. So the harder and stronger your melee attack was on an enemy, the more damage the dot damage is going to do. And that's important because we want the dot damage to pretty much finish off any enemies that don't die instantly from our first punch. And that's really important because the more dot damage you do, it means enemies melt much more easily. Now I've got a bloom with this anointment on it, mostly because it came with a guaranteed 60% bonus melee damage. The bloom is a DLC free item, but you do not need it at all. This is just happen to be anything. You can have any weapon with a blade on it with this anointment and you'll get the exact same result. You could have a purple Jacob's pistol with the exact same melee damage bonus and get the same result. I just happen to have a bloom. And the reason I'm also using a bloom instead of something like a COV pistol with 120% bonus melee damage, as that would be more damage, is simply because there's actually an animation delay when using COV weapons, period. And I'll quickly show that off. So while I can't really show off the melee speed, I can show off something. So I've got a Jacob's pistol here and a COV pistol in my other hand. Now I'm going to just quickly take off the Spiritual Driver so I don't have the annoying ticking sound. So as you can see, I'm using Phase Gust and I'm able to just spam it like so. Now I switch to the COV pistol, and you'll see that there is there's a big delay here. And that does also go for melee punches as well. Though you won't really notice this with, just spamming it without an enemy in front. It's very noticeable when you're actually trying to punch enemies. And that can be a problem because if you can't actually kill an enemy, if your melee is a lot slower, they can get your health down in the health gate. And if you're not able to punch quick enough, that can lead to you getting downed. And has led to me getting downed in the past. So I'd prefer sacrificing 60% bonus melee damage for something that smacks a lot quicker. And that's just personal preference though. If you prefer the extra 60% melee damage on a COV weapon, then go for it. I just prefer the consistency. Speaking of the COV weapon I was holding, I've got a gargoyle with the on-action skill and splash damage is increased by 200%. Now, you don't need a gargoyle to have this specific anointment. You could have any weapon that can come with this anointment. Ideally one with a blade, which is why I've got a gargoyle, and the gargoyle is again, another DLC free exclusive weapon. Again, you can replace this with any kind of non-DLC equivalent. So I think you can also get a Kibsworth that has bonus melee damage, and it can come with this splash anointment, so that's something to note as well. Now, the reason we're carrying this around is for simply bossing and when using the Stinger Shield. The Stinger Shield, which I'll go over quickly, right here. The Stinger Shield is an interesting melee shield as it gives you bonus damage while your shield is at full capacity, but it also it triggers a Nova that deals melee damage and scales off your melee damage when it's depleted. And the Stinger Shield you'll want to have is an on-action skill start. Activate any effects that trigger on that shield, break or fill. And the reason for this is because we'll be able to grab someone with Ties That Bind, which is our action skill, and the Nova will go off. And this Nova scales, as I've mentioned, off of melee damage, but it also scales off of splash damage. So that's why we've got the Gargoyle, because enemies with immune phases are going to take more than one Nova to kill, since, immune phases. And while using the 300/90 anointment weapon is going to be great for your first Nova, you want something to be able to do more damage with subsequent follow-up Novas. So the 200 splash anointment is the best in slot there, as it's going to give your Novas more damage. Alternatively, you could have a on-action skill and 100% bonus melee damage anointment, if you want to be able to boost the damage of the Novas a little bit more, and if the splash damage anointment's being too hard to find, but splash damage is best in slot here. Next we've got a Face Puncher. The Face Puncher I have is on action skill and melee damage increased by 100% for a short time. You can substitute this anointment for the 100% weapon damage on action skill and anointment, as they actually do pretty much the exact same thing. And the reason I say that is because the Face Puncher scales off of both gun damage and melee damage. And that's why we're also using the Face Puncher, because it scales off melee damage and its attacks count as melee attacks. So this allows us to have a great weapon to take out enemies from a very far distance away. Specifically flying enemies is what I like to use the Face Puncher for. And it's also really good for getting second wins, as this build's focused more on, actually punching people and not, using guns, since that's not as fun. If a melee build's supposed to rely on melee, not shooting an enemy. If you want to use the Face Puncher, and then also in other cases you want to use the Stinger as your main source of damage, I'll have builds that will be coming out in the near future that focuses on using each one, in its own separate build. This build is more of a jack of all trades melee build that allows you to do it all in a way. But yeah, the Face Puncher is nice to have for, ranged attacks when you can't really bridge the gap, since as enemies may be flying or they're just literally in a place that they cannot be punched. As for the third weapon, the last weapon I should say, any weapon of your choice really, a rocket launcher for better second wins, just any weapon of your choice really. It's not really a big issue. The main shield you'll be using is a Brawler Ward. The Brawler Ward can give you up to 300% melee damage while your shield is depleted. It can also give you 25% weapon damage while your shield is depleted, and it gives you 2% max health regen per second when your shields are active, and 4% max health regen when your shields are depleted, which is really handy. This is just a great melee shield in general. Now you'll notice that I have an on action skill and melee damage increased by 100% for a short time anointment on my Brawler Ward, and that my Brawler Ward is also a level 1. The lower, you'll really want to try get yourself a Brawler Ward as lower level as possible with this anointment and a 300%. The 300% void roll, which is really important because that's the most damage. The reason you want a low level one is so the shield can be broken really easily, so you can just have your shield active and then just trigger the spiritual driver to break it instantly. Now, it's not the end of the world if you don't have a low level one, as you can chuck on a weapon that deals splash damage that can break the shield for you, or you could use something like a low level sellout to keep or something like that to break your shield initially or keep your shields down. There are ways of getting a level 1 anointed gear like I have here. It mostly requires just a second profile or joining a friend's lobby, a friend's games who's on Mayhem 10 while you're using a character that's at level 1 or something, and then having your friend kill the boss for you, or using the second profile kill shit for you. It's a little annoying and it does suck, and I'd really like it if we had a void shield that had 0 capacity like in Borderlands 2, as that would make things so much easier. But at this current point in time, this is kind of the best you can do. So yeah. This is for the class mod. We're using the spiritual driver, as I've mentioned. Spiritual driver gives you bonus gun damage while you're moving, and the faster you move, the more gun damage you deal. This is not really anything important, as this doesn't help us. It kinda helps when using the face puncher, but it's not noticeable and we're not focused on the face puncher. The big thing here is that whenever you activate your action skill, you apply an action skill element to yourself. And this is great for keeping your shields down, and in my case also breaking my shield. And there's also procs mindfulness, and mindfulness is one of Amara's skills, which I'll go over in the skills section. But mindfulness gives you movement speed whenever you take damage, and you can have up to 25 stacks of mindfulness, and 25 stacks of bonus movement speed equals a lot of movement speed, which is really handy. As for the bonus rolls on your spiritual driver, I mean, you want as many points of this mindfulness as possible. The other 2 points in skills don't really matter. I've got mine in helping hands, which means more damage reduction. As for the extra bonus rolls, you want melee damage, action skill cooldown rate as the 2 you want to focus on getting the most. Melee damage is really important because the spiritual driver doesn't boost melee damage. Well, it used to actually when it first came out, but it no longer does. So that's a shame. But yeah, you want to get melee damage on it because this class mod doesn't give you any inherent melee damage bonuses, unlike something like the Muse or the Breaker. So giving yourself more damage is really helpful. Action skill cooldown rate is the second most important one, I'd argue, because you want to be able to use your action skill as much as possible, which is ties that bind, so you can get the maximum amount of mobbing potential you can have, and having that come back quicker is a really important thing. As for the third roll, I happen to have splash damage, so that helps out with the stinger a bit. Action skill damage is also not that bad to have, and also health regen would also be pretty handy to have, as having your health come back quicker is always a good thing. As for grenades, I recommend a hex grenade with the on action skill and gain 50% bonus elemental damage with your weapons for 10 seconds. The reason we want this anointment is because when used with the spiritual driver, you're able to get the maximum 25 stacks just by fake grasping once. If you don't have any gear with this anointment on it, you only get 15 stacks. I don't know why that's the case, but it just is. So yeah, that's the only reason we want this anointment, because this actually doesn't give us any real helpful damage with a melee build, which is a shame, but that's just how it is. And the reason I recommend a hex is because it actually works as a healing grenade when you have enough points spec'd into sustainment, which what sustainment does is allows your elemental attacks to give you lifesteal. And while it says your elemental weapons give you lifesteal, this doesn't really work. This isn't really true, as melee damage and elemental grenades and a bunch of other things can give you healing, so long as it does elemental damage. So yeah, so this allows the hex grenade to turn into basically a transfusion grenade, but actually good. If you do have access to one, you could also use a fish slap grenade. Now, the fish slap grenade is only going to be able to legitimately be obtained at level 57, as it's no longer obtainable, and that's because it was part of the Revenge of the Cartels seasonal event. And this grenade's really good because it's a grenade that scales off of melee damage in a similar way to how the Stinger's Nova and the Face Punch's shotgun damage scales off of melee. So yeah, if you want just a grenade that does pure damage, go the fish slap. If you don't have access to one, no big deal, use the cloning hex. And yeah, that's pretty much all the gear. So moving on to the skills, on screen right now should be a picture of all the skill trees, so feel free to screenshot this so you can keep it for future reference and stuff, if you just want to know what skills are spec'd into. So as you can see, I capstoned green tree and then went fairly deep down into the orange tree and then spent the rest of the points in the blue tree. So I guess we'll start with the green tree. First off, we've got 5 points into clarity. This will give us some constant health regeneration, which I find really handy. I just prefer the health regeneration over max health. That's just me though. Next, we've got 1 point into root to rise. This gives you a little bit of extra maximum health. Only specking 1 point here just to go down the skill tree. Next, we've got 5 points into helping hands. It's 7 in my case because of my class mod. After using your action skill, you gain some damage reduction. Taking less damage is always a good thing. Next, we've got Find Your Center. You gain increased melee damage, and after using your action skill, you gain increased melee range. Being able to punch further is a really handy thing, and in some cases, this skill actually seems to break, and you can just sometimes punch someone from across, from stupid distances. It's weird. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it's funny. And plus, you get more melee damage, which is important. Next, we've got 3 points into mindfulness. It's 6 points for me because I've got my class mod on. Whenever Amara takes damage, you gain a stack of mindfulness, and for every stack, you'll gain improved shield recharge delay and movement speed. The movement speed is the big thing here. The shield recharge delay, if you're using something like I've got, which is a very low level Brawler Ward, the shield recharge delay isn't a big issue because your shield's going to be pretty much down pretty much forever, which is really good. So you're just basically gaining free movement speed, and with Spiritual Driver you'll be able to proc this all the time basically. Next, we've got 1 with Nature, 5 out of 5. You gain increased maximum health and elemental damage resistance to whatever your action skill element is. I like the elemental damage reduction, as taking less elemental damage is always nice. The max health is a nice bonus though. Next, we've got 1 point into Guardian Angel. This allows you to basically go into your fight for your life and get out of it instantly once every 2 minutes. This is really handy for a melee build because, well, with a melee build, you kind of need to accept that you'll be going down every so often. So having a free get out of jail free card essentially is really handy. Next, we've got 5 points into Jab Cross. Whenever you deal melee damage to an enemy, you gain increased action skill damage and increased gun damage for a few seconds. The increased gun damage actually works when using the face puncher, but the big thing here is the action skill damage, as ties that bind. When enemies are linked together with ties that bind, the damage when you smack one person, the link damage actually counts as action skill damage, so being able to boost that by a pretty big amount thanks to Jab Cross is really handy. Next, we've got 1 point to do onto others. Whenever an enemy damages you, you'll automatically throw out an energy orb that matches your action skill element. And this orb can deal a decent amount of damage, but mostly it's here for visual flair, and it can also give you a little bit of healing, which is nice. So it's just here because I had spare points and there was nowhere else to really effectively put them, and I didn't really worry about it. Lastly, for the green tree, we've got Blitz. Whenever you punch an enemy, you'll dash a short distance and perform a special melee attack. If Blitz kills an enemy, the cooldown on Blitz is immediately reset, and you get a bonus 100% extra melee damage. Blitz is really handy, but it's also really buggy because you can just lunge at enemies and you just deal extreme amounts of damage in one punch. But this comes at the problem with Blitz being a little buggy, because sometimes Blitz just refuses to connect or refuses to let you go far. I don't know why that is, and it's just something you'll just have to accept. but the 100% bonus melee damage is just, you can't ignore that for a melee build. So yeah, that's the green tree. Moving on to the orange tree, we've got 5 points in the Anima. Status effects deal increased damage over time and have increased duration. And your action skill status effects deals even more damage. This is really good to have because we'll be using the Unleash the Dragon, so the dot damage on the Unleash the Dragon will be increased by a lot, and its damage will also be increased. And the status effect duration also affects how long the dot on ourselves procced by the Spiritual Driver will last, so having that last for longer means that our shields are going to stay down for longer, which is really handy. Next we've got 1 point into Infusion. This converts a portion of damage dealt by Amara's weapons into an action skill element. Reason we've got 1 point here is to mostly go down the skill tree, but 1 point here also allows us to get a little bit of action skill element onto our face puncher, and the face puncher does non-elemental damage, so this allows the face puncher to give us a little bit of healing, which is nice. So yeah. Next we got 5 points into Wildfire. Whenever you apply status effect to an enemy, it has a chance to spread to other nearby enemies, which is kind of cool, but again, this is mostly to go down the skill tree. Next we've got Illuminated Fist. You get increased melee damage, and your melee damage is converted to your action skill element, so that's going to be Fire, Shock, or Corrosive. This is really nice to have, as your matching elements is generally the best thing you want to do in a Borderlands game to deal the most amount of damage. And being able to have elemental melee attacks is really nice. Plus the bonus melee damage is what we're here for anyway. Next we've got 5 points into Tempest. Amara deals increased elemental damage and shock damage is increased even further. This basically allows, with this skill, this means that our melee damage is going to do even more, because we've got Illuminated Fist. So yeah, more damage, very nice. Next we've got 3 points into Catharsis. Whenever Amara triggers an elemental effect on an enemy, when the enemy dies from that, the enemy explodes, dealing her attuned elemental damage along with any other element that currently is afflicted on that enemy. So basically, when an enemy dies from elemental shit, they explode and deal elemental damage, which is kind of cool, but it's not, the damage on it isn't exactly that much. It's just cool looking, and we need to go down the skill tree. While we're here though, you want to grab Ties That Bind. You'll be able to grab enemies. You'll be able to grab an enemy and lock them in place for a few seconds, and nearby enemies near the grass target are linked, and any damage dealt to a linked target is shared between all other linked targets. Now on Mayhem 10, linked targets actually take more damage than the target you initially punch, and this is why Ties That Bind is insanely powerful on Mayhem 10, as you'll be able to grab one enemy, punch them, and then everything around them just dies because they take hundreds of millions of damage, which is insane. And it's great fun, and the cooldown is relatively quick too, so 18 seconds. We'll be able to shorten that down with getting action skill cooldown rate on like a class mod and stuff, and also with one of our skills I'll be going over shortly. Lastly, for the orange tree, we'll be wanting to grab 4 points into Sustainment. You gain lifesteal whenever you deal elemental damage with your weapons. The with her weapons part is irrelevant, as it's just whenever you do elemental damage. So you'll be able to punch an enemy and get all your health back by having this skill. And the reason we have 4 points here is to actually make our hex grenades have a pretty decent amount of healing, so we can chuck a grenade out and get some nice free healing without having to actually shoot enemies, which is nice. So yeah, moving on to the blue tree finally. We've got 5 points into Do Harm. Killing an enemy grants a stack of rush, and activating her action skill will consume all rush stacks. For every stack of rush consumed, action skill damage is temporarily increased. The reason we have this maxed out is to be able to give Ties That Bind even more damage. So that's really handy to have. We have 1 point in Violent Tapestry. Applying a status effect to an enemy will give us rush stacks. For every rush stacks that's consumed, status effect chance is temporarily increased. We were grabbing this to be able to apply status effects to get rush stacks by applying status effects to enemies. And with this build, you'll be pretty much able to apply status effects yourself by actually just using your action skill once. You'll be able to get at least one stack of Do Harm by simply applying a status effect to yourself, which is really handy. And with this, we'll be able to punch enemies and gain rush stacks really easily, so that's nice to have. Next, we're going to grab 5 points into Restless. This gives you increased action skill cooldown rate. Being able to spam Ties That Bind as much as possible is really important, so having this helps out. Lastly, for the blue tree, we're going to grab Soul Sap. A portion of all damage dealt by Amara's action skill is returned to her or her nearby allies as health. The little bit of extra health is really nice and can also be kind of helpful when, you know, playing with friends and stuff, as a little bit of healing can go to your friends, which is nice. And the reason we're grabbing this instead of something like Revelation is so that we don't mess with the 300/90 anointments effect when trying to punch a enemy with Ties That Bind. As if an enemy drops below 90% health, the 300/90 anointment stops working and you're getting less damage when punching an enemy in Ties That Bind. So this allows us to control it a lot more easily, and we get a little bit of free health, which is nice. And yeah, that's all for the skills. Alright, so moving on to the Guardian ranks, there's a few Guardian rank skills that I feel like are worth mentioning, as having them on or off it actually can affect the melee build. So yeah, in the blue tree with Survivor, Shield Reboot and Emergency Response, you want to have these skills disabled. The reason for that is because Shield Reboot allows you to trigger your shield regeneration whenever you kill an enemy, which we do not want. And Emergency Response improves your shield recharge delay and recharge rate based on your missing health, which we also do not want. We want our shield to stay down for as long as possible, and so having it come back whenever you kill an enemy, or having it come back a lot quicker when our health's really low, is not ideal. So yeah. Lastly, for Guardian ranks, we need to talk about Groundbreaker in the Enforcer tree. Melee attacks or slams will trigger an aftershock, dealing 25% of all non-melee damage you have dealt over the last 5 seconds. This can be kind of helpful, as when you're using the Unleash the Dragon, the dot damage from that does not count as melee damage, so this can build up Groundbreaker. So if you punch an enemy with the Unleash the Dragon and they are taking dot damage, you can wait a couple seconds and then punch again to get another decent chunk out of them to get more, so Groundbreaker can give you bonus damage. This can be really handy to have. However, with this build, you're not really proccing it often enough to be able to get it. It's a nice little bonus, but it's not something that's going to be, you know, you're going to need to rely on. It's just bonus damage for the sake of bonus damage. So yeah, that's the Guardian ranks. So the Mayhem Modifiers I used for this video are Speed Demon, Mob Mentality, Drone Ranger, and Not the Face. And out of all these modifiers, the only one I'd really think about replacing is Mob Mentality, and I'd replace that with the Healy Avenger. So let's go over each modifier. Speed Demon. Whenever you kill an enemy, you gain increased movement speed, and you can get this, and you can stack this up 3 times. I just want the extra movement speed, because who doesn't want to be able to just run around like an absolute lunatic? And when you have maxed out Speed Demon and maxed out Mindfulness, you'll be able to move so fast that you can actually perform certain skips in both the Melee one and Guardian Takedown, which is really, really cool. So yeah, I recommend Speed Demon a lot. What I would really advise against, though, is not using, I would really recommend you do not use Slayer. Slayer, while it makes sense, you'd think it makes sense for using in a melee build, as when an enemy is low, they'll glow blue and you'll be able to insta-kill them. The reason we don't want this is because when enemies die from Slayer, they shoot out hellfires and shield boosters, and the shield boosters will, you know, refill our shield, which we do not want. So that's why I don't advise using Slayer. As for the medium modifiers, Mob Mentality. This just gives enemies bonus damage and bonus fire rate when they're near other enemies. It's not that much, and I don't think it's a big deal. But I would recommend trying to get the Healy Avenger instead. The Healy Avenger basically has a little drone heart thing that flies out of enemies sometimes whenever you kill them, and this heart thing can, if it touches an enemy, it will heal them. Otherwise you can destroy it and it can give you free healing. It's basically a modifier that doesn't affect the game much. Mob Mentality, though, if you want a little bit of extra difficulty, you can chuck it on and it doesn't really affect the game much. Drone Ranger. Enemies have a chance to spawn with a healing drone that supports them, and if an enemy dies, a healing drone will find a new target to support. The healing on these drones isn't actually that much, and it only really becomes noticeable when when it's healing enemy, when you've got multiple drones on one single target. But with this build, you'll generally be killing enemies quickly enough where the healing drones aren't going to be a big issue. Plus, they're really easy to kill, so you could just, you know, if they're really being an issue, just shoot them with the face puncher. And the great thing about the drone rangers is that they can actually act as second wind thing. So if you see if you see a drone ranger thing, and you're in fight for your life, you could just shoot one of them and get basically a free second wind, which is really cool. Lastly, the very hard modifier, not the face. Critical hit damage is reduced by 75%. This is not an issue whatsoever because melee cannot hit critical hits. And yeah, that's why we grabbed this, because this effectively doesn't change the game at all for a melee build, as you're not going to be able to hit critical hits to begin with, so you're not losing anything really. So yeah, that wraps up everything for this build. If you enjoyed this build video, then feel free to hit that like button and maybe subscribe to my channel if you want. Sorry if this was a little longer, I just get really into talking about melee, as melee builds are just my most favourite ways to play Borderlands really, as there's something just satisfying about punching enemies to death in a game that's all about guns. It's just something so satisfying about that, and it's really fun. And this build's actually really fun to play as well, because while you lack a little bit of damage compared to other melee builds, you make up for it by able to move incredibly fast. And who doesn't want to run super fast while punching things to death? It's just fun for me. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you guys later.